Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the show. I'm so excited for you to listen to this one as I get to sit down with someone that I've been on podcasts with before, but she has not been to this show yet. Paula Pant, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.
I'm excited for this conversation because just even before we hit record, I've already learned that we're in alignment on a lot of things as it comes to money. So
Mhm.
I love to give our audience just quick value right out of the gate. And so I want to talk about your podcast, your community, your brand that's called Afford Anything. Those are
Yes.
two words right now that people are probably thinking about. All right, guys, this would be great. But with the price of eggs and
Right.
inflation and my 401k getting tanked because of this economy shift that we're in right now, how the heck do I afford anything? So the person that's listening right now
Yeah.
that's a little stressed about it, what value can you give them right out of the gate?
So the concept of affording anything, and by the way, I totally understand how people think. Well, how can I? Like the top search term that includes the words "afford anything" is the term "I can't
Mm,
afford anything." That is the top term.
makes
The
sense.
concept of affording anything, and this is a mental shift that I want everyone listening to at least be open to embracing. It's the empowering concept that you can afford anything, you just can't afford everything.
I
And
like
so
that.
affording anything means being incredibly conscious about the trade-offs that are involved in getting the life that you want, because so much of the time we spend money on things that society tells us we quote unquote should want. We should have X, we should have Y, we should have Z, right? And so we spend money on these expensive things that have the social standing of adulthood, but we actually don't care about all of those things. So maybe there's someone who's listening to this who's really, you're really into scuba diving, and that's your passion. And if that is you, then maybe you're willing to live in an apartment instead of a single family home, right?
Mm.
Or in a duplex instead of a single family home, right? Maybe you're willing to just forever drive used cars. You're willing to be conscious of those trade-offs because this thing, this passion is so important to you. And by the way, I don't want to glorify travel because the same can be true conversely. Maybe you're really, really passionate about having the big house in the suburbs with the white picket fence, and you actually don't care that much about this Instagram glorified international travel. More power to you, right? It's not about the
Yeah.
what, it's about the thought. So
Mm.
that's the notion.
I love that. What are you willing to trade off? Do you
Yeah.
have something that maybe a process or something that you've had to go through? And it's
Mhm.
interesting because I know your background. You did the travel thing, you did the
Yeah.
backpack, you did. I'm actually on the other side. I wanted big house, fancy cars, all the things.
Nice.
Travel was nice, but it wasn't something that I needed to do at the moment. I
Right.
kind so I it's interesting how people can just, and I love how you say that, like, don't glorify one lifestyle. Pick which
Right.
one works for you and what you want. Is there a process that people can go through to try to decipher like how to build that life so that they're not just picking up something that they heard on a social media feed that seems sexy in the moment?
Right, right. I mean, so I think that y most people either you're very, very clear about what your passion is, we'll go back to that scuba diving example, right?
Mhm.
Either you're very clear about that, or if you're not, you are curious about certain things. So if you don't know your passion, you at least know your curiosities. And so follow that curiosity, go in the direction of that. And as you're following that curiosity, let's say that maybe your curiosity is like well, cars, right? You will intentionally use an example that is often disparaged in the
Mm.
mainstream media because people say, "Ah, don't spend too much money on cars, don't buy a new car."
Mhm.
All right, fine. I don't personally care about I don't actually even own a car. I live in New York
Oh,
City.
oh, you don't need a car.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I also personally just don't care a lot about them.
Mhm.
But I have a very good friend who she's an automotive journalist. She
Oh,
loves cars.
yes.
And she was a person who had stacks of car magazines in her bedroom as a kid. If you know that you're at least curious about that, then what I would do is have some kind of number in mind of some goal that you have that you want to attain within that. And maybe your goal is to go to the Indy 500 and you want to watch an Indy 500 race in real life, right? If that's your goal, put an actual dollar amount on it in literal dollars and cents, like
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be perfect, just run an estimate of what you think that's going to cost. And then every time you're thinking about making some purchase, ask yourself, would I rather have this or would I rather be $100 closer towards
Mm.
that trip to the Indy 500?
I love that. And you know what? You actually talk about something. I think it was in your blog that I read just doing some research for the interview that you talk about how to, and like people should take a look at what they earn for the
Yeah,
year, decide how much that is per hour so that they can
right.
identify how many hours of their life they're
Yes.
trading away. And it kind of seems like that fits into that too, right? Because maybe if you find out that the Indy 500 is going to cost, I have no idea, I've never been. Let's say it's 20 grand because you're going to do it bougie. I don't know. Like maybe you realize that you don't want to trade that many hours of your life. Can you share a little bit about your process that you take people through on that kind of like cost analysis of time?
Yeah, absolutely. So here is very, very easy, quick and dirty math. You don't even have to take out your phone calculator. You can just do this in your head. All right. So assume that the average, if you work full time, assume that you work 2,000 hours a year. So that's 40 hours a week times 50 weeks a year. Right. So what that means is if you get paid a salary, your salary cut in half is your hourly rate. So if you make $80,000 a year, then that 80 cut in half is 40, you make $40 an hour.
Hmm.
If you make 80,000 a year, you make 40 bucks an hour. If you make
Okay.
100,000 a year, you make 50 bucks an hour. You make 60,000 a year, you make 30 bucks an hour.
So then you're going to figure that out of what that item costs, whether that is a car, a boat, the Indy 500, to see how much you're actually trading away your time.
Exactly, exactly. It is simplistic math because obviously I'm not taking benefits into account, yada, yada, yada. But it's just a really easy back of the envelope way to say, wait a second, I make uh, $70,000 a year. That means I make $35 an hour.
Hmm.
And so at $35 an hour, if this thing is going to cost me $3,500, that's going to be 100 hours of my time.
Wow. When you identify it like that, like, is it really, in my world, I know a lot of women like the bag and the shoes and all the things, right? And people
Right.
are literally going broke trying to look rich because
Right.
they're putting it on a credit card. They can't really afford it. They can't pay cash for the car that they need or whatever it may be. And so they're really going broke in the process. And it's not just money broke, it's time broke that we don't get
Right.
back. And I think we don't realize that, at least for me, I didn't realize that until I got even older, that like time is so precious that like
Yeah.
making sure you have time freedom above all is like so critically important.
Right. Right.
Now,
Exactly. Can I throw in one more thing? You asked
please.
earlier
Yes.
about how do you, if let's say that you don't have that overwhelming passion for cars or scuba diving or whatever, how do you know what to prioritize?
Mhm.
So one litmus test that I like to ask myself is if you were stranded on a desert island and nobody knew that you made this purchase, and let's just assume for the sake of this example that you were stranded on a desert island, but somehow magically you had access to anything that you wanted. If you were stranded on a desert island and no one could see that you made this purchase, would you still make it?
That's so
Um,
good.
and I talked to this one woman who was like, she was like, "For me, the joy that I get from having, like, really great nails," she was like, "if I was on a desert island and nobody could see my nails, I would still want them because I enjoy looking at them, and it gives me so much just joy." And I was like,
That's cool.
boom, there you
Yeah.
go. Now you know. And she said she was like, by contrast, she was like, "I don't care about my hair. Don't care. If I were on a desert island, I'd shave it off." You know? And I was like, "All right, perfect. Now you know what matters to you and what doesn't." And that's the concept of affording anything.
Mm.
It's getting rid of the societal should.
Mm.
It's getting rid of you should spend money in this way, getting to a place of I know that I can't afford everything. So how do I make sure that I'm spending money in a way that aligns with my highest priorities?
I love that, and I love the deserted island thing. I've always looked at it as from social media because I grew up in a time where social media wasn't around, so it was
Right.
like, but now I feel like so many people just buy things to flex. It's like, what if there was a law that you were not allowed to post anything you bought? would you still buy
Right.
it? Like, would you
Yeah.
still travel there? Would you still fly that way? Like, so I think that that's interesting because we don't realize how bombarded we are with consumerism and just making sure that like we're fed everything that we think we need to belong to. I would still get my hair done if I was on it, but I would not do my nails.
Yeah,
So
I'm
like,
exactly the same. I care about my hair, I don't care
yes,
about my nails. So,
that's right.
you can see today, like, my I think my hair looks good,
It does look
hair's
good.
done, but
Yes.
my nails, I painted these myself,
Can't even
right?
tell. They look great.
Oh, well, thank you, thank
They look
you.
great. They look great. And I want to speak for a minute back because let's say someone listening is like, look, I can give up the cars, I can give up all the things. Obviously we have about 50-50% women to men audience. So there's probably a lot of motorheads. My dad was a mechanic, so I tend to
Mhm.
like cars. There's probably a lot of women that like all the designer stuff as well. And I have to admit, I like nice things. But what about the person that says, I don't care about all that stuff? I want to not trade time for money. I want to be able to own my
Mhm.
schedule and do what
Right.
I want when I want, however I want to do it. What does that person need to start focusing on right now, regardless if they've done it to this point or not? How can we get them that goal?
Okay, so what you're talking about, and this is one of my favorite topics, is this concept called financial independence. And financial independence is the point at which you your potential passive income, and I'm using every single word here carefully, and I'm going to break down exactly why I'm using each one. The point at which your potential passive income, typically through investments, but not always, is enough. So you want to have enough money set aside that it could theoretically support you for the rest of your life. Now, the reason that I say it in that way is because a lot of people believe that if you reach financial independence, there is some law that requires you to suddenly like quit, get pulled out of your office kicking and screaming, quit your job whether you want to or not, and you must live on your money. And if you have $1 million portfolio, that means that you are living on 4% of that, which is 40,000 a
Yeah.
year, and you are living on precisely that forever for the rest of your life. Amen.
Yeah.
So that's a major misconception about the financial
Hmm.
independence movement. And so financial independence is simply that you have enough money such that that money theoretically could support you. You don't have to be living on it, but you know that you could if you needed to. And so where that really becomes important is, let's say that you love your job and you never want to leave. You would love to work there until you're 150 years old, but you you have a brother and you love your brother, and if he were to ever call you and say, I just had a terminal diagnosis and I have 6 months left, you would want the ability to drop everything, quit
Hmm.
your job on a dime, and be by his side for those last 6 months. And you would want the ability to know that you can still keep the lights on, you can still keep food in the fridge, you can still pay your bills, even if you had to suddenly quit your job completely unexpectedly, right? That's the power of financial independence.
Hmm.
And so I firmly believe that everyone, even if you do love your job, everyone should pursue financial independence, because that means that when you reach that point, work becomes optional. And I want to clear up another myth, because again, this goes back to that myth of some people think that if you reach it, some police force mandates that you quit your job, right? Like, and that's a big misconception. The other misconception is, oh, it means that you have to live at your same current standard. No, like, if you have a brother with a terminal illness, you're not going to be going to Michelin star restaurants. You're not going to be buying the fancy outdoor gear to go rock climbing, right? Like, you don't necessarily need enough money to live at your current standard of living. Being work optional simply means that if the worst were to happen, you could maintain a reasonable, decent, basic standard of living.
Hmm. They're not coming to take your house, right? They're not coming
Yeah.
to take your car. Like you're going to be able to be okay to get by.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So it's okay if in the best case scenario you want a standard of living where you're going, taking multiple vacations every year, and you're going skiing. Great, great. Like, you don't necessarily need that total amount in order to reach financial independence. You just need enough. And so that's why I define it as the point at which your potential passive income,
Mhm.
which is typically through investments, is enough.
Mhm. Yeah, I kind of did this twice. I thought that when you exited a company and you made work optional, that you retired. That lasted like 75 days in my world. And I was like, I cannot do this. I'm way too young to not work. So then I was like, I think we'll just make work optional. But like, especially as an entrepreneur, once you're an entrepreneur, you're always an entrepreneur. It doesn't matter. You're just getting into the next thing.
Right.
I think that that is what truly everyone's after. It's like, can I just decide when I want to do this?
Yeah.
If something happened to a child or a parent or a sibling, can I drop everything and go be there with them? Like, and that to me is really what wealth is all about, in my opinion. I think that's what everyone should really be after. Is there anything that you work with people on as far as here's how we do that? Here's where you start, whether it's with debt, with investments. I know everybody has their own flavor to this. What's
Yeah.
yours? If you had to summarize it.
Yeah. So first, the only I'm fundamentally what we want to do is we want to grow the gap between what we earn and what we spend. That gap is typically referred to as savings, but I don't like to use that term because the term savings often connotes frugality.
Hmm.
And so I don't mean savings in the context of frugality. I mean savings as simply the delta between income and expense. And the only way to grow that delta is to either earn more or spend less or a combination of both. And between the two, now obviously in the spend less category, if there's obvious low hanging fruit, cool, awesome, take care of it. Pick the obvious low hanging fruit. You know what that is. But beyond that, um, chasing the spend less category too much, like it very quickly hits a point of diminishing returns.
Hmm.
And so I recommend that people don't spend too much time chasing the spend less category. Pick the low hanging fruit, call it done, and then focus on increasing the income side of the equation because there is endless sky where that can go. Like you can only frugal down so far, but you can't shrink your way to greatness. And if instead you focus on earning more, that's where the real power is, and that's where you actually start to move the needle. And so the the framework is fundamentally, it's simple, but it's not easy. The framework is grow the gap, invest the gap, repeat. And that's it.
I love that because I think that that is really at its core. It's like you can talk about all kinds of tactics and tips, but really, money at its basic bare bones is you make more, spend less. Like
Yeah.
that's it. And at the end of the day, if you are not overspending, if you don't have a bunch of credit card debt, if you're not going out and blowing and spending more than you earn, which obviously, hello, that's low hanging fruit. Stop doing that. Like, but other than that, it's like we have to earn our way out of it, right?
Yeah.
And it's also has to be at a point where you don't want to have to worry about the price of eggs, right? If
Yeah.
you get to a certain amount where you're going to buy eggs, they're expensive, sometimes they're not, like you want to earn enough that you don't even have to think about it. So I always say, like, don't kind of major in minor things, right? How do we cut that,
Oh,
and
yeah.
how do we then grow the earnings? So you did this, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you went to college, you got your dream job, and then all of a sudden you were realizing this is not going to cut it. What process did you go through to realize I need to earn my way out of this?
Yeah. So out of college, my starting salary, and I should say I loved the job. I loved everything about it except for the pay. But my starting salary in 2005, when I graduated from college, was $21,000 per year. Now, adjusted for inflation, that's the equivalent of about 32,000 in today's dollars.
Mhm.
So imagine earning a full-time salary with a college degree of 31,000 in
Were
today's
you in New
dollars.
York at this point?
Oh, no, I was in Boulder, Colorado.
Oh, I was gonna say, how on earth
Yeah.
were you in okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was in Boulder, Colorado. I lived in a basement studio apartment. My rent was 400 a month. My car was 400. And when I tell people that, they're like, "Do you mean 400 a month?" And I'm like, "No, no, no. My car was $400."
Oh my gosh. You just bought it, like, $400 cash.
$400 cash.
What kinda
The
car
the
was it?
the
Do you
seller
remember?
wanted 450, but I talked him down to 4.
What was it? Do
Um
you remember?
It was a Toyota Corolla. It was 23 years old, and
Oh my
I
god.
was 21 years old at the time, so my car was older than me.
I love it. I love it. So you get this job, you're obviously not making enough. You're in a little studio apartment. What do you start to do next? When do you realize that this is not going to cut it for Paula to have the life that she wants?
Right. So I spent 3 years there, and at the time that I quit that job, which was in 2008, I was making a total of 31,000 a year. Now that's in 2008 dollars, so adjust that for inflation, that's probably maybe 40,000, 42, 43,000 in today's dollars. But while I was there, during the 3 years that I was at the newspaper, I went to a couple of journalism conferences, and at those conferences, they had these little breakouts based on what section of journalism you're in, right? So they had television, they had magazine, they had newspaper. And then there's this little thing called freelance. And I was like, huh, what's that? Never heard of it. Right. So I started going to those sessions, and that was when I first became aware of the fact that it was possible to earn any type of an income outside of having a standard W 2 employer. I
Mhm.
had no idea that was even an option. And so while I was at the newspaper, I started freelancing. And the first article that I wrote, and I wrote it for Dining Out magazine, they paid at the time 50 cents a word. And so I would write a 300 word piece for them. I'd make $150, and that whole thing would take me like max 2 hours, including, like, not, and I don't mean just the writing, I mean, like, include, door to door, right?
Mhm.
Including all of the emailing with editors, all of the calling sources to get a quote, blah, 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 like, every single piece of it took a max of 2 hours. I made $150, so my hourly rate is 75 bucks an hour, and for somebody who's making $30,000 a year,
Mhm.
which we know how to do the math on that. That's $15 an hour,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
For somebody who's making at her day job the equivalent of $15 an hour to have a side hustle where suddenly I'm making $75 an hour, it was like life. I mean, that was the inflection point where I saw the possibilities. And so I freelanced every evening and weekend for the 3 years that I was at the newspaper, saved every penny of that freelance income. And at the time that I quit my job, which was in 2008, I had $25,000 saved. And that was, if you think about the fact that I was making 31,000 and I'd started at 21,000, that was basically the equivalent of 1 year's worth of
Wow.
income for me, right? That
Yeah.
I had saved just in that 3-year time span. I then went to countries. I bought a one-way plane ticket to Egypt for $700, and I spent the next 27 months primarily in countries where the dollar exchange rate really worked in my favor: Egypt, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. And while there, I wasn't freelancing full time. I was freelancing like on the side. I was also just wanted to travel and wanted to experience the culture and just be there, but I lived in places where the dollar went a lot further, and I lived on an average of 1,000 US dollars per month,
Hmm.
and just had, like, an amazing time, kept my skills sharp, kept freelancing. So I was, like, spending money in Laotian kip,
Oh,
but
yeah.
earning money in US dollars.
Hmm.
So I did that until 2010, and then I came back to the US and began freelancing, and I very, very quickly figured out that as a freelancer, I was fundamentally still trading my time for money. I no longer had a boss over me, and I no longer had like a salary with, 3% increase, like where I had to beg for a raise. But I didn't fundamentally own the underlying asset. I didn't own the means of production. So by virtue of freelancing, I was making a much better hourly rate than I had previously made, but I wasn't participating in the upside of any of those publications. And so I decided that I wanted to start my own platform in which I could actually directly own the upside. And so for the next 5 years, I simultaneously freelanced in order to pay my bills, while also building out my own company, which it morphed over time. Initially, it started out as a content management and marketing company
Mhm.
where I was doing, like, not just freelancing, but I was doing whole content management for predominantly small businesses. Like if you're a CPA firm, right?
Mhm.
Or if you're a financial advisor, you have a website, you need content for that website, but you don't want to manage that process. You don't want to
Mhm.
put together the editorial calendar and do the SEO research and find a whole bunch of freelancers, right? Like there's a whole management process to like having a steady stream of content on your site. So I would just take over the management of all of that. And that was an opportunity I saw when I was a freelancer because I was
Mhm.
interfacing with those managers and I was like, "Wait a second, why am I freelancing for a manager? Why don't I just become the manager and then just start hiring freelancers under me?" So that was the first thing that I did in order to grow a business. And so I did that for a while and then in kind of in parallel with that, so I guess we've got 3 parallels going, I also started Afford Anything. And over time, Afford Anything grew a big enough audience that in early 2016, I was able to drop the content management and then just go full time into Afford Anything.
Oh, okay. So 2015 was kind of like your first taste at entrepreneurship because prior, like being a freelancer, you're not really an entrepreneur, you're kind of self-employed, right? You're
Yeah.
it's a side hustle. And then but you're not really like going after clients, building a business, owning this thing. So then you started building the business, increasing your income.
Mhm.
So before I get into that, I want to back up a hot second because you talked about saving $25,000 and then going and traveling a bunch
Yeah.
of places, right? And almost earned your entire annual salary to do
Right.
that. For the person listening that's like, "Hey, that sounds like a lot of fun, but I've got kids, I'm married," right? They've got responsibilities. They can't just pick up and go into another country where the dollar's better.
Yeah.
If you were in a different situation then,
Mhm.
would you have done something differently with that $25,000? Would you have invested it? Would you have put it in a 401k? Would you have started a Roth IRA if you had a different life experience at that point?
Right. So the first question I would ask to anyone who's like got kids is, do you want to go travel the world or not? Because the answer is going to be very different depending on whether or not they want to do it. If they want to, and you have to want it, but if they want to, then what I would encourage them to do is look up the mini retirement community and the road schooling community because there are a lot of examples of people. Jillian Johnsrud, for example, she has 6 kids, 5 living, 1 deceased,
Mhm.
but she has 6 kids, and she frequently takes her kids on these extended travels. So she piled all of her kids into an RV and they did a big, it was like life is a classroom, life is a big field trip, right? So she put all of her kids into an RV and they did a big cross country trip and they went to all of these different national parks and she homeschooled them slash road schooled them, from this RV. And I mentioned one of her children, her eldest, passed away when he was in his early 20s. And she has often said that the memories that she has with him from the fact that they traveled, like long-term traveled together, is like this huge source of consolation. Like
Mm,
it's one of the most fond memories that she has. And she's like, "Every day I thank God that I did that with him,"
mm.
you know?
'Cause you
And that
spent
he got
real
to experience
time
that.
with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because you see, like, I mean, a lot of kid and again, there's I love how you framed that though. You were like, "Do you wanna do that or not?" Because those 2 things aren't exclusive, and I think oftentimes, maybe
Right,
society teaches us, maybe I picked that up somewhere in my life or that we adopt that belief that those 2 things are exclusive. Like, you
right.
can't just travel the world because you have kids and responsibilities, but you're saying, well, actually, people have done both.
Right, not only have people done both, kids I think are the biggest motivation to do so because like it's fun to see other countries for yourself, but it's way more fun when you take a kid like being with my niece at the Taj Mahal, like seeing
Oh,
it through the eyes of a child, that's so much more impactful than just doing it for yourself.
mm,
Um
yeah.
Last year I was at the pyramids. It was my second time being there.
Mm,
And there were so many kids, like so just kids running around everywhere, you
mhm,
know? Not just Egyptian kids, but also foreign visitor kids, right?
yeah.
And being able to share that experience and not just on a 1 week holiday, but like, hey kids, we're gonna road school for a year. We're going to like I know that I know that every Saturday I drive you to soccer practice, but have you ever played cricket in the middle of the street? You
Mm,
know?
yeah,
That's what you're gonna be doing this year. We're gonna be in Croatia, and you're gonna learn how to play cricket in the middle of the street with a bunch of, like, all your friends, you
yeah.
know?
What a life experience too,
Right?
right? But is there something about, because you talk about this, I talk, which I love. You talk a lot about, and maybe this isn't necessarily a broke belief, people thinking that they're exclusive, but there is like psychology. There's a lot of psychology behind
Mm,
finance. And you
yes.
talk about this, I talk about, like, it's a very important thing, the behavior that we have, the psychology that we have, the BS beliefs, if you will, that pick up. Do you see that in the people that you work with? Do you see that being a really big part, or is it more the tactic of them knowing where to put my money?
Oh, no, 90 the tactics are easy. 90% of it is the psychology of it. Financial psychology is probably the single biggest determinant in your outcomes because we are taught so many scripts about money when we're kids, right? Some that we're taught directly and some that we simply learn through observation. So, for example, we are taught that uh, rich people are evil. If you think about pop culture, The Simpsons, Montgomery Burns
Yeah.
is the evil character in The Simpsons.
Yeah.
In It's a Wonderful Life, it's the rich guy is the villain. In like pretty much every Hallmark movie or in every cartoon, it's always the rich person who is the villain. And so we internalize these narratives at the subconscious level. There's a part of us that kind of goes, well, I don't want to be rich, or I want to continue identifying as being poor or middle class because that makes me relatable.
Hmm.
That makes me a good guy.
Yep.
Like I don't want to be, I want to be Homer Simpson. I don't want to be Montgomery Burns.
Hmm.
Homer Simpson is the everyman.
Right.
Marge
Mhm.
Simpson is the everywoman. Like you want to be the Simpsons. You don't want to be Montgomery Burns. And so when little opportunities come up, people might think at a conscious level, like, well, of course, I'd love to be, but like the fact that there are so many small opportunities to level up that people often don't take, and I'm guilty of this as well. A lot of that can stem from money negativity, which is taught to us as kids.
Give me an example of not leveling up when there's an opportunity. Like what?
Oh, I mean, at the very, very micro level, it's every time that I decide that I'm going to spend a weekend hungover instead of building my business, right? Like, um, I'm not saying don't go out with your friends,
Ooh. So
but
you think
like,
that's a conscious decision
right?
somehow someone's making to not continue to build the life that they so desperately say that they want, right?
Right.
It's like mean what you say what you mean. So if you do want that, this behavior doesn't align with that
Yeah.
belief. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. I've never heard anyone explain that like that. I like that. So
Exactly.
so what's an example, cuz you say you still trip this up and people love when we are honest about ourselves that we still struggle with stuff.
Yeah.
What's an example of something that you currently do that you'll catch yourself going, "Oh, Paula,
You know that show Paradise on, I think it's on Hulu? I binged that in 2 days.
oh, okay,
Yeah.
alright. Oh, that's a good example, okay. So
Yeah,
just something like that that
you
doesn't
know
align with what it is that you wanna do because you could have used those 2 days in some other way.
well, you know what I haven't done yet? I haven't filed my taxes for this year. And frankly, we're
Mm,
getting pretty darn close to April, and I think that there's a decent chance I might miss that deadline, and then I'm gonna have to pay some penalties. But you know
mm,
what I did instead? I binged Paradise in 2 days.
right, because of the avoidance, and we all have that. It's like
Yeah.
we avoid the things we don't wanna do. So, do you have anything that when you're working or in content that you're producing that you share of people, how can they flip that? How can they attack the thing they want to avoid?
So I think accountability is huge. Like it's difficult to do anything when you're in isolation. And
Mm,
so having somebody there, I call it body doubling is a term for it, but like having another person, ideally physically like in the flesh, but if you can't do that, then at a minimum via Zoom virtually, having another person who's there who can just be in the room or in the Zoom room with you. And there are actually websites where you can like make these agreements with a friend, or there are also websites where you can literally just get on Zoom with somebody. I think there's this thing called Focus Mate. You can
hmm,
just get on Zoom with somebody and be like, all right, for the next 2 hours, I'm going to work on this. And then you just sit in complete silence on Zoom, but the fact that you know that somebody is quote unquote "in the room with you" is a
Mm.
motivator that keeps you going. And it's I mean, I keep using Zoom as an example. I'm doing that for the sake of all of the people who don't have an in-person option, but if
Mhm.
you have an in-person option, that is even better. And by the way, I recommend that it is not your spouse because you don't want this to devolve into like a spousal bickering, right?
Mhm.
You want this to be like, we're here, let's get down to business. Like this, this is what we've come together for this purpose. And at the end of this, we're going to both go home to our separate homes in our separate ways.
What was the name of that? Was it
Oh,
Focus Me?
Focus Mate,
Focus
Focus Mate. I
Mate.
haven't actually
Oh.
used it, but I've heard many people recommend it.
You know what's so interesting? I've often thought, like, not that I don't do courses and stuff, but like when I was deciding if I wanted to go into that world, I was like, we should just have like a group where people have to like report for office hours because
Yeah,
so many entrepreneurs are constantly distracted.
right.
And then it's like everybody works so hard to not have a schedule. But then when you don't have a schedule, sometimes people just their focus gets lost. Like
Yeah,
they just end up scrolling or they end up going to post an Instagram post, but then they stay on for 2 hours and don't realize that they didn't get anything accomplished. It's like if you had to check in, it's like everything that we don't want sometimes is actually what's holding us accountable. So I
right.
love that. It sounds like somebody already has that, but it's probably why we work in industrious, probably a lot of these like co-work spaces work so well because at least you're going into something with other people that are also doing it.
Yeah, I'm actually in a WeWork right now.
Are
That's
you?
yeah,
Oh,
that's what you're
great.
seeing in the background.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think it was Elon was it Elon Musk's son that I had just heard, because I was doing some research on Tesla and everything that was going on, and it was his son said, I don't remember which one because he has so many kids, but one of them said something about the fact that, like, why do we go out to dinner? And I don't know
Mhm.
if you heard this, but the
Mm-mm.
Elon was like, what do you mean? Why do you go out to dinner? Well, we have all the food here. You know, we have stuff here. Like, why do we go? And then the one day they went out to dinner as a family and he was sitting there and he goes, oh, I get it. We go out to dinner to have dinner with strangers. And he
Huh.
was a little kid that like made this observation. And I was like, you know what? He's right.
Yeah.
We kind of do go out to, and so to me, it's the same thing. We go to a workspace where we can work anywhere in the world in order to be around strangers because there's something about the community aspect and the
Right.
accountability piece that like makes us show up, I think, in a different way because you're gonna get dressed, you're gonna,
Mhm.
and so I think that's really important. So focus mate. I'm gonna make sure that everyone gets that. I think that's a really important thing. You talk about earning more versus saving more. I
Mm.
love that. We talked a lot about that. We talked about the trade-offs. If someone is listening right now and they're like, all right, I know I need to be doing all of these things. I'm just not where I want to be. Maybe they're turning a zero birthday, 40, 50, and they just aren't where they want to be. Maybe they went through a divorce or some
Mhm.
life change that maybe they lost some of their wealth. Is there anything that you could speak to that person that feels really behind, feels like they really need to do something, they want to apply some tactics? Where would you have them start to start getting into the better position?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing I would say to them is you are not behind because the whole social myth that everything is supposed to happen on some type of a calendar is it's ridiculous. The very, very linear thinking that by the age of 25 you should have X and by 30 you should have Y and by 40 you should have Z. It's it's useless linear thinking that a it doesn't serve any function other than just making people feel bad about themselves. B, it's not even true because there are so many people in the world who don't follow that route and they end up having great lives. And I'll give you one example. My parents, they born and raised in Kathmandu, Nepal, didn't come to the United States until they were in their late 30s. And uh, they they adopted me, but they adopted me when they were 43. They came to the US in their late 30s. My dad came as a grad student, and so he was, in grad school for the first several he finished grad school at the age of 39, I believe. So it was at the age of 39, 40 that he got his first job in the US that paid US dollars. And then it wasn't until 10 years after that, at the age of 50, that he opened his first retirement account. And it
Wow.
was 40 was when he got his first job and, they had their first apartment. I was born 3 years later, and I was born, like, right around the time that they were getting their first car. My dad took the bus to work, you know?
Wow.
So if you've owned a car prior to the age of 43, you're already doing better than my dad, you know? And I say that I'm kind of putting that all in air
I love
quotes,
that.
but I'm putting better in air quotes because there is no timeline. Like my dad's an example of literally millions and millions and millions of immigrants who come to the US at the age of 40 and then get their first apartment and their first car and open their first retirement account much, much later in life. There are tons of people who don't open their first retirement account until they're in their 50s, just like him. And so don't get caught up in the idea that you're supposed to be doing these things by certain ages because the reality is that's not even true. There are plenty of people around you who also have not done certain things by certain ages. And guess what? By the time they reach their 80s and they look back, they're doing just fine. They're happy with the way their life turned out, like my dad is, super happy, totally doing great. Like you can begin your life fresh at 50, and then by the time you're 75, you've had 25 years of like building this incredible life, right? Even if day 1 is at the age of 50.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's good. Yeah, it's kind of like it's even the saying of oh, it left me, but there's like a bunch of entrepreneurs. Was it maybe Martha Stewart and Kate, like a bunch of these different entrepreneurs didn't start till much later.
Right.
So it's kind of like, it's like, take the pressure off of yourself that if you are quote unquote behind compared
Yeah.
to what society says, it's, I think sometimes too that cripples us as far as
Right.
what to do next. So are you a big fan of, because everyone's probably like, all right, we're talking about money. My 401k is getting
Yeah.
crushed with stocks. They were green for a second today and then everything went red again.
Mhm.
What is your financial vehicles or what you teach people that they
Mhm.
should be paying attention to as far as investing goes? Do you have a certain lane that you like to stick in?
Absolutely, absolutely. So first of all, your tax advantaged accounts, your 401k, your IRA, or preferably your Roth IRA, 403b if you are a teacher or in the nonprofit sector. So any type of tax advantaged account, prioritize those first. And the way to think about a tax advantaged account is that fundamentally this account represents a deal between you and the government in which the government says, hey, I'll give you some type of a tax break in exchange for you promising not to touch that money until you reach a certain age. And so I don't even like to think of them as retirement accounts because the word retirement is really loaded. And many people associate retirement with the cessation of income producing activity. But retirement is, when we call a 401k a retirement account, a 401k is not actually tied to your occupational status. It's tied to your age. So just think of it as an age restricted account. So your 401k, your 403b, your 457, your IRA, all of those are simply age restricted accounts. And I would prioritize those first because you get such great tax breaks. And between a traditional account versus a Roth account, for most people, I'm speaking in broad generalities, but for most people, most of the time, put money into a Roth account if you can and prioritize those ahead of traditional accounts. But any type of tax advantaged account you want, which is an age restricted account, you want to prioritize first. After that, after you've maxed out what you can within those age restricted accounts,
Mhm.
then the rest of your investments can go into a taxable brokerage account. And what's great about tax, once you get used to the tax advantage, people often don't like putting money in a taxable brokerage because they're like, oh, I'm investing, but I don't even get a tax break. But what you do get from a taxable brokerage account is flexibility. And so, an example of a taxable brokerage account, Robinhood is really popular with
Mhm.
early investors. It's a little bit controversial, but like what it has done indisputably is it's brought a bunch of people who didn't previously invest into the investing world.
Mhm.
And so, that is an example of a taxable brokerage account.
Yeah, like E-Trade, anything like that. Yeah.
Exactly, E-Trade, any of them, and honestly, even Vanguard, Schwab, Fidelity, any
Mhm.
place where you can open a tax advantaged account, also have the taxable brokerage account options as well.
Hmm. Yeah. And do you have a rule of thumb that you say people should start focusing on putting this percentage in? Like how much
Mm.
should people start to invest of their total either taxable income or their gross, or do you have a certain model that you like?
So, what I encourage people to do is whatever I like to meet people where they're at. So, whatever amount you're currently saving, save 1% extra this month. So, if you're starting at zero, then my challenge to you for this month is to go from 0 to 1, right? And if currently you're saving 5% of your income, my challenge to you is to go from 5% to 6%. So, no matter where you're currently starting from, my challenge to you is that this month I want you to increase that by an additional 1%. And then the following month, go 1% more. And then the following month, go 1% more. And if you can keep this up for a year, then by the end of that year, you're going to be saving 12% more than what you're currently saving today. Now, if making that adjustment on a monthly basis is like, I don't know if I can, that's a little bit too much. Cool. Do it once a season, winter, spring, summer, fall. Just do it once a season and keep that up for the next 3 or 4 years. But by virtue of making this adjustment in 1% increments, and 1% is $10 per every thousand that you make. So if you bring home 5,000 a month, 1% is $50.
Hmm. Yeah.
And by virtue of making this adjustment in 1% increments, it feels very doable. And that is so necessary because, as I said, personal finance is far more mental than it is tactical.
Hmm. I agree. It's behavior. So I like the 1% because it at least is developing the habit of
Mhm.
like, you haven't done this before, you have to do this. You are a lot kinder about it than I am. I tend to kick people a little bit in the ass. They know on the show, I'm like, if you can't at least save this much, you're overspending. Like,
Mm,
if you can't take 1%, 5%, and at least start with that, like you are robbing from your future because you're either not making enough or you're spending too much. So we need to increase the earned income or decrease your expenses so that you can do that. Because if you don't ever do that, you will always be trading time for money.
right.
So I love the step into it because I can sometimes come across probably a little too harsh about it, but I think that it's also needed because if you don't do this, you will never have the option to make work optional. And I think that's really what everybody is about. So if we can do the hard thing now, if we can say no to a few things now, if we can go all in and not do the binge on Netflix or whatever and focus on maybe those 2 days, I don't care if it's running DoorDash or picking up some freelance stuff, like whatever, so that you can, as you say, build the gap, right?
Mhm.
Earn more, spend less so that you can build a bigger gap to invest more and stop living on tomorrow's income because that's really what you're doing if you're not investing now. So,
Exactly.
but I like how you say it way kinder than I do.
Oh,
we
thank
have good we
you.
have good energy balance. I love
Thank you. Thank you.
it. One of the things that we talk about, and this will just be the final question I sometimes ask, is so often we hear the word wealth. We hear wealth as it's generated, it's generational, it's so many things. But now that you've been on this journey of building it and being independent with money and talking about money and teaching people about money, how would you define wealth now, today? What does wealth mean to Paula Pant today?
Ooh, wealth is having options,
Mm,
right? Wealth is choice. And I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. Choice when it comes to, money is simply a tool that you can leverage in order to make the choices that you want. And that includes the choice of how you spend your time. So money is a tool that you can trade in order to buy back your time. And so true wealth is measured not in dollars, but in choices, in the
mm.
amount of autonomy that we have.
I love that. I love it. This was such a great conversation. Let everyone know where can they find out more about you, what you're doing, all
Yeah.
of the things.
So I'm the host of the Afford Anything podcast. And so you can find us on any major podcast platform. And we also teach people how to ask for a raise because that's one of the single highest leverage things that you can do in order to get more money in the door because you don't even have to start a side hustle for that. You make more money doing exactly the same job that you're doing right now. And so many people are leaving thousands on the table by not asking for a raise. So affordanything.com/your next raise to find out about when we teach our classes, or if we're not currently in a class mode, then you can get on the early notification list for the next time that'll be open. We have that available periodically. So yeah, those are the two ways that you can find me.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks for spending the time and just having this conversation. It's always great. It was great seeing you again. And we'll link all that information in the show notes. Thanks, Paula.
Thank you.
All right, guys, if you found value in today's episode, please leave us a review, subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple, or wherever you tune in. Thanks again for spending this time with me today. We'll see you next time.